So, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, and welcome to this month's Analyst Relations Forum webinar. I'm really delighted to be here with Jonathan Yarmis, with Michael Myers, and with Stephen Loudermilk to talk about social media and analyst relations. I'm going to introduce our speakers quickly, and then if I haven't just clicked on a hyperlink, I've just clicked on a hyperlink, crazy. But there we are, back. I'm just going to introduce our speakers. Stephen Loudermilk, who heads Analyst Relations at LexisNexis. Michael Myers, who has an incredible track record, most recently at HP, but in a number of other fascinating roles, especially in services-rich firms in the software industry. Jonathan Yarmis, obviously somebody who's got incredible experience both as an industry analyst and as an analyst relations practitioner, and myself. I'm really delighted to have these guys together on the call. Just to step through the kind of logistics for today. Almost everybody is muted. You can use the chat bar if you want to ask questions, depending on how quickly we go. Hey, we're all hugely opinionated people, so maybe we won't have too much time. Please interrupt us, type into the chat bar if you have questions, or email them to any of the people who are on the call, and we'll probably pay attention. We had a preparatory call, and these are the topics that we broadly said that we would talk through, but we're not going to stick to them very heavily. We've got some slides with a few talking points, but we may not pay much attention to those either, because everyone on this call is somebody who's got a lot of experience with analyst relations, has got a good insight into social media. So I think we don't necessarily have to go in at a very, very introductory level. You know, that we did have a call with Barbara French and Patricia Valash from Symantec last month, which is on our YouTube page. That gives a great introduction for people who are maybe listening to this call and want to make sure they've got the right context. But what we're going to do is go straight into these topics and pretty much go in a more or less random order as we go through. I think maybe I kind of had those photographs up on the chart with Jonathan and then Mike and then Stephen, and I may simply go past the three of them in that order with each of these topics, just seeing what they want to throw in, simply because that's the order that I've got their heads, and I will hopefully not have to say very much at all. So the first of these topics is social media and the analyst ecosystem. And I suppose some of the topics that we might be thinking about there is, you know, how the landscape of influence is changing and how social media is impacting on the market. I wonder if I could start off with you, Jonathan. What are your thoughts about social media and the analyst ecosystem?
I think there are several ways of looking at this. One is, from the perspective of how you influence the analyst, and related to that, or commensurate with that, is how the analyst influences the client. And as long back ago as 2008, 2009, when I was at AMR, one of the things I came to realize, and the firm came to realize as a whole, was nobody's reading our research anymore. We write all. There were notes that people wrote that you'd look at the end of a month and there'd be 7 page views, and if you drop a search note in the forest and nobody hears it, does it make an impact? And I think social media is changing the whole perspective of the way we influence analysts and the way analysts influence users. And it presents so many more opportunities, and I'm constantly reminded, I'm, to say the least, an avid social media user. I'm nearing 30,000 tweets, which means I have no life. But the net result is there are a category of people, when wearing my analyst hat, from both AR professionals and users who I exert significant amount of influence, or at the very least awareness, because of my social media footprint, and it puts me at a competitive advantage over those people we're just throwing it out into a vacuum. And the flip side from AR professionals, I remember vividly a couple of years ago, I was at a Microsoft event and was exchanging pleasantries with a Microsoft AR person and another analyst. And after we walked away, the analyst said to me, wow, I don't interact with them nearly as much as you do. And I said, I haven't seen them in 2 years. This is all social media activity. And it enabled me to have greater familiarity and what resulted in better business outcomes because of that level of engagement. So I really think it's game changing, and that analyst firms and AR professionals don't fully appreciate the opportunity that they've got here.
Michael, what do you think about that? Do you think the opportunity isn't appreciated, or?
So to build on what Jonathan said, I think that social media has really changed the interaction between AR departments, AR functions, and the analysts. And I think it also depends on the type of organization that you belong to. I've worked in some very large, highly matrixed organizations where there was a high degree of control over the message. In one instance, you were free to tweet and interact with analysts that covered your particular areas of responsibility. In other instances, the message had to be tightly controlled by a centralized communications organization. So I think those types of interactions don't work when you control the message, because both analysts and other people who are reading your interactions recognize the difference between spontaneous interactions as opposed to highly controlled interactions. So I think social media should be free. You should be able to interact as you see fit, always maintaining propriety in terms of how you're representing your organization. But I think you need to be able to interact on a regular basis, on a casual basis, and an informal basis.
And Stephen, what do you think?
Building upon what Jonathan and Michael just talked about, I firmly believe that the analyst ecosystem and the AR ecosystem is dramatically changing with social media. It is a 24/7 business these days. As Jonathan mentioned before, there's a lot of lengthy market research reports that have come out. What I do quite frequently from my standpoint is check Twitter on a regular basis just to see what the analysts are saying, not just about my company, but competitors, what they're saying about, big trends in the industry, for example, around big data or data brokering and things like that. It doesn't mean I'm actually interacting with them on a regular basis, but I'm monitoring what they're saying, which is really critical. And it's that intelligence that you get from the analyst, not just face-to-face, but real-time through social media. That's really important to an organization like mine, and I'm sure other organizations. In terms of the acceptance of social media, I totally agree with what Michael and Jonathan were saying. It's not just Twitter, but even leveraging Facebook, Google+, LinkedIn, to build on those relationships, build on those ideas that are coming forth on a regular basis. So in essence, the analyst ecosystem has changed dramatically, and social media has been a really good influence.
And how do we think it's changed the
Stephen,
way that...
I would add, when you said what the analysts are saying, Duncan, I was just going to add to what Stephen said, what he was saying about what the analysts are saying. I think there are some number of us that actually signal what we're going to say. At the very least, you can get some hints on research positions, and also, there are a lot of times when I'm about to write something, I'll go tweet about it or Facebook about it and try and get impact from, you know, a diverse community before I actually go write. So it's part of my research process at this point. So it's not just what what I've written, but what I'm going to write.
And do we think it blurs the lines in some way about the research process?
Building on what Jonathan just said, I think that's a key way that AR folks can interact with the analysts. It used to be you'd go on to the website and figure out what the research agenda would be. But for those analysts who are tweeting on a regular basis or who are posting to Facebook or otherwise communicating via social media, it's a good way to stay on top of their research agenda so you can influence what's coming down the pike as it pertains to your particular organization.
Have we seen ways in which it's really changed the way in which analysts are seen? I mean, the whole way in which people are getting more readership is important, but I think also the way in which different sorts of analysts are engaging differently with social media means that actually you have a whole layer of people who've got much more profile now. It would have been impossible 10 years ago to think about Constellation or RedMonk or firms like that getting the kind of profile that they have. How does that change things?
Well,
I think it changes. Oh.
Yeah, go
Go ahead,
Jonathan.
Mike. Okay,
No,
I'd say, I'd say, in some ways it's actually changed the influence because if you remember, and I go back, I started as an analyst at Gartner in 1987, and back then when news broke, we were a go-to resource for the media to get, insight and perspective. Now the big firms with their research processes, it takes them so long to get something into the market, and so long is no different than it was 25 years ago. It's just that there are 7,000 other voices who are in 14 seconds after the event breaks. That if you're not on social media, I think your impact in the news cycle is muted, and that's certainly something where some analysts have been marginalized a little bit and other analysts enhanced because of the ability to respond in near real time.
Right, and to add to that, just like users of social media in general, you know your friends who post a picture of every lunch that they have or every cute cat pic that they have. So you have to discern which analysts are actually posting information that's beneficial to you as opposed to self-aggrandizing for their particular purpose. And I think the savvy social media user can determine the difference between the two.
Not that there's anything wrong with cute cat pictures.
No, not at all.
So should we move on maybe just to take a look at our next topic, which is, strategy and planning. I think lots of analyst relations programs are not really planning in any way the social media that they're doing. They're getting into it quite accidentally, and they're not often really planning. Definitely not even at the level of individuals. They're very not even developing general policies. Where do people? Where should teams be starting off in the way that they're planning?
Well, I think one good way of looking at it is just like with your analyst relations plan, you probably have analysts tiered by tier 1, tier 2, niche, boutique analyst firms. And then for each individual area that you cover, you may have some analysts who are at the top of your list for product A, and some analysts who are at the top of your list for product B. I think what you can do is stratify your analysts in the same way, but in terms of their usage of social media. And the same analysts that you would stay in touch with quarterly briefings or monthly inquiry calls or whatever, you want to make sure that you build some sort of social media interaction with those same analysts, assuming that they're active on social media. So I think that's a baseline for social AR strategy.
I think a big opportunity's been missed. we just here in the States had the Academy Awards this weekend, and social teams for all sorts of brands were mobilized to look for opportunities to insert their messaging into a broader discussion. There are myriad opportunities for competitive hijacking, message amplification, and so on. It's South by Southwest this week. Why don't AR teams have plans to look for discussions when somebody starts talking about, ooh, here's the hot thing going on, in Austin. An established brand can say, yeah, we've been doing that. Here's our response. And oh, by the way, we do it at enterprise scale and have been thinking about this for 7 years. So there's so many discussions that are going on that I think, that there's an opportunity to inject the message, and it's not purely an AR function, and this may blur some lines, but if analysts are participating in the conversations around events, AR teams can do so and can help their corporate communication brethren to engage in a broader real-time kind of conversation that really is the big opportunity of social media.
Well, to be fair, though, Jonathan, if I were in a situation like that, the mantra in a lot of corporations is do more with less, and a lot of AR practitioners out there have their hands full already, and to be able to do something like that may just be too much, for them to handle. If a corporate communications team that has a social media function is made aware of it from the AR group, that there's an opportunity, then I think that that's a great way of leveraging social media. But a lot of times there's just not the bandwidth to be able to do something like that. On the other hand, if you have a regular pattern of interacting with your analysts who are at these other events, then that presents the opportunity for you to do something and, as you mentioned, hijack the conversation.
Yeah, let me just challenge you a little bit, and I don't want to suggest that bandwidth is unlimited, but one of the things I found with social media is it's a great multitasking opportunity. I'm sure all the participants on this call are doing nothing other than listening to us and thinking about how they're going to challenge and ask questions. But some people on occasion find that social media is a great multitasking skill. So I don't think it's as necessarily additive to bandwidth consumption, as, it's not a zero-sum game is what I'm saying.
Oh, I would have responded to you, but I was busy playing words with friends. No, and I agree with you, Jonathan, and multitasking and social media go hand in hand. I guess it all depends on how other events line up. If you're in the middle of a product launch, you certainly don't have the bandwidth, but if you're in a normal, regular cycle, you certainly have the bandwidth to be able to do other activities.
How are people dealing with the
problem? You need good tools. This is one of those things. If you
No, please finish off, Jonathan.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you don't have the proper set of tools, yes, it is much more additive. But I'm sure some of you, like I, have many columns in TweetDeck that try and segregate out the streams of your information. So rather than trying to find needles in haystacks, I have a neat set of hay bales that I can look at that are much more manageable, that make it easier to identify and respond.
I think it'll be interesting to pick up on tools later on, and especially I would love to know something about the contrast between using general tools, and obviously some people on the call have been using tools like Architect, so it would be interesting to weigh that up. But I was just thinking about earlier on what was being said about tiering analysts. I think sometimes there's a contradiction between the fact that the analysts who are most active on social media aren't necessarily the ones who are the most influential. So what do you do to avoid getting drawn into the situation where the effort that you're expanding on social media might simply be allocated to those people in line with their activity rather than in line with their importance? I think very often I see people kind of getting carried away a little bit, and putting a lot of energy into interacting with analysts who maybe got a high profile in social media, but might not be influential in the market of the organization that is interacting with them? Have people come across techniques to deal with that?
Well, I think one of the things that I do, Michael talked about it before, is tiering the analyst, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, social media influencers. I do that quite a bit. One of the things I do when analysts are at key events is take a look at the hashtags for these key events that they're going to, whether it's an analyst conference, whether it's a vendor conference, whether it's one of our own conferences. Taking a look at that content, taking a look, segregating that content, and basically providing a report on all the social media interactions that are happening. That's really a key function for any analyst relations group is taking that information and really bubbling it up to the next level. I think what you're saying before, Duncan, about, I'm not going to name names, of course, but I think every analyst has an opinion. Sometimes they do get carried away with what they're all passionate about, their subject matters, and you have to get different opinions, different angles on different technology issues that are shaping the landscape. So that's really my opinion on that question.
And finally, how about policy implications? Have people found it hard to get clear ownership of social media, or have they found it hard to get other people to follow clear guidelines? I mean, this can be a real nightmare in some organizations.
Well, guidelines in my mind are always meant to be broken or twisted or bent a little bit. Obviously, you need to follow corporate guidelines when it comes to protecting the brand and the reputation of the company. But when I was at SAP, I started up 2 Twitter channels without benefit of going through all of the corporate red tape. And once they were out there successfully, they sort of got grandfathered underneath the rules. But yes, you have to maintain some semblance of obeying the rules. And again, the complexity of your organization has a great deal to do with that. If you're in a large, multi-siloed communications organization, one silo may think they own social media. So you really have to work collaboratively across these silos. It just means another meeting to coordinate messaging. But the key thing is, if you as an analyst relations practitioner, if you own the message that's going out to the analyst community, you want to make sure that the social media people follow your lead as opposed to them driving the message.
Let's move on
It's
to
also, I have tended to subscribe to the notion it's easier to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. So, and that's very much a stylistic thing and how you establish your position with the organization. But, there have been some spectacular social media failures, not so much in the analyst space, but more broadly. And the challenge gets to be, the failures are highly visible, and the notion that success has 1,000 parents, failure only one. There's a personal risk-reward equation here.
how about some of the mechanisms? I mean, looking at foundational policies and metrics. I mean, what are the lessons that people have learned in terms of really trying to work out confidentiality, prioritizing the different media analysis and metrics? What I imagine people will have had very different experiences.
I guess from my perspective, it's a hard one because we're all wrestling with the how do you measure this stuff, and clout is always, for instance, the clout with a K is a familiar whipping boy. Is this how we measure some of this stuff, and yet at the same time, while it's a whipping boy, it's in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. I think we're still trying to figure out how to measure the impact and effectiveness of social media campaigns. Big brands have a problem with this, and I think we in the analyst and AR profession have an even bigger issue that we haven't devoted near the resources of the big brands, and if they don't have it right yet, we're still challenged.
Well, I think the key thing, what I try to do when I drive metrics is find out really what does management want measured, and then have a conversation with them in terms of what's realistic in terms of an outcome for measuring, especially with social media. With working with the analysts, there's some tried and true metrics such as share of voice, tonality, and things like that, and you can tie that back to the published research. But with a social media stream, be it Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever, it's a little more amorphous. And I think the savvy executive is going to recognize that. And if you have a heart-to-heart with her, she's going to understand that you can't really come up with a hard and fast metric. Now, around product launches or announcements, things like that, and you have a dedicated hash, or events, and you have a dedicated hashtag, then you can come up with some metrics in terms of tonality, in terms of a word cloud, things like that, number of mentions versus the last event, things like that, so you can show that you've driven interaction higher vis-a-vis the last equivalent event or launch. So those are some of the challenges with metrics that I've overcome in that way.
Stephen, how have you and your colleagues been approaching these questions?
Well, from a policy and metric standpoint, I think we're all faced with the reality, especially in today's media and analyst relations space, that metrics mean everything. So, for me and our organization, it's really about measuring the pulse of everything that the media and the analysts are saying. Like we were talking about before with social media, it's still a gray area. It's still in its infancy. How do you really track those conversations? How do you build it into your plan? Tools like yours, Duncan Architect, and other tools, help you do that a lot better. What you need to do is, really track those conversations and build them into your policies and frameworks moving forward. So, that really helps our organization grow in terms of social media.
Yeah, I think one thing that AR is missing a little bit, and if we're always fighting for resources and credibility with a larger, media / public relations organization, one thing that I think is underappreciated, journalists are probably the most avid users of Twitter, of any community with which I engage on a regular basis. And I know that there's impact, from, me as an analyst to journalist. I'm engaging in lots of conversations. There are a number of times I've ended up in news stories never having spoken to the reporter, just having exchanged a couple of tweets. And I think, the analyst-reporter relationship is one that if there were an ability to generate more metrics about, who's engaging with whom, it might inform a better integrated AR/PR strategy.
How are people dealing with the kinds of metrics that colleagues in corporate social media teams are using? I mean, I generally find, the more centrally located somebody is in the social media community, the more skeptical they are about metrics and measurement, unless they're working for a company that sells social media metrics and measurement. So people are often very focused on very simple measures like tweet reach, really counting how far did your tweet go. That's quite a concrete thing and very easy to measure. Whereas cloud schools, though they're ubiquitously used, it's very unclear what that really means. So are people finding, that there are different priorities, different metrics being preferred by people who are in corporate social media teams from the ones that we're using on the analyst relations side?
Well, no matter what metric you have, I guess you really have to come down to what does it really mean. So you talk about tweet reach, how far your tweet goes, how do you tie that back to some sort of business objective? I think that's the challenge that folks have, and I'd be interested in hearing, when we open it up for questions, or if people want to post it in the chat box, how other folks have addressed that issue.
Yeah, because I agree. One of the challenges I think Twitter has with monetization, and and it would be really interesting, is they know so little about any of us, so that when tweets start propagating around, there's no true measure of wow, this tweet was seen by somebody who's got billion-dollar signing authority versus this tweet is seen by a 14-year-old who's got nothing better to do than engage in Twitter. So, lacking those accountability metrics, reach numbers are, almost historical accidents. Anecdotally, I can tell you what brands kind of use clout and what don't, because I've got a good clout score, and there are those who I get real rapid response from, and I know they're not responding to everybody that way. And then there are those where the crickets are chirping, and it's like, nope, they're probably not using clout, or otherwise I would have gotten a response here.
And maybe that's something to do with which of those brands are most effective in a consumer market, and are tracking consumers' tweets, because they see how that directly impacts on their reputation in uncontrollable ways. Do you think that's perhaps what's going on?
Yeah, I would say largely that's the case. There are a couple of B2B instances where I get response, but yes, it's very much more the consumer brands that do that.
So we've spoken about the opportunity to take questions, and we're going to wrap up in 10 minutes or so. But let's just kind of go around the imaginary table and just see, are there any best practices or top tips that any of us would like to share, or any kind of thoughts that we have now that we've been talking over this topic for half an hour?
Well, I think I touched on the one tip in terms of how to stratify your analysts. Similar to the way you tier them, you want to make sure you identify analysts who are tweeting about topics that are of use to you, beneficial to you, that align with your particular objectives. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, always maintain a degree of professionalism when you're tweeting. Your personality can shine through to some degree, but you also have to remember that you represent your corporation, and you need to keep it on a somewhat professional level. We all know some of the missteps of people in the past that have gone on to become Twitter disasters and cost people their jobs. So I think those two things you want to keep in mind. How to stratify, how to tier your analysts, and maintain professionalism in your interactions.
Yeah, from my standpoint, my top 3 tips would be, first of all, don't be afraid. Get involved today in terms of interacting with your analyst, via social media. You're going to make mistakes. However, like Michael and Jonathan have been stating, you get to know your analyst at a deeper, more personal level, and then a professional level. Number two is start building a plan, integrating it into your existing analyst relations plan, and see how that works. And then number three, measure, and provide those metrics to your management teams. That'll really help in terms of social media ROI in the long run.
My mantra forever has been an engaged analyst is an influenceable analyst. And engagement isn't just inviting them to an analyst day. Engagement isn't just providing feedback when they submit a note for review. I think, in general, and certainly, the big firms, obviously slower, and the new emerging players, an HFS or a Constellation, there may be agendas out there, but so much is dictated by real time, and you can get a good sense. When I send you a note for review, your ability to change the note is really bounded. I mean, that at that point, it's probably, barring a gaping error, is 95% done, and we're fighting for the 5%. The earlier you can engage with the analyst over their thought process, the greater the opportunity you have to change their perspective. And those conversations can be taking place on social media with or without you. And to miss those opportunities, I think, is unfortunate and leaves you fighting for that last 5%.
I've had a question in from Alan. How about etiquette for analyst engagement in social media? Does anyone want to take that on?
One of the things that I think etiquette, it's a much more informal medium, and we've forever observed, wouldn't it be great if there was a sarcasm font? The ability to misunderstand and go off the reservation is large, but I think it's a much more informal mechanism, and Mike and Steve, you both talked about the challenges of engaging within corporate guidelines. A lot of analysts seem less bound by their corporate guidelines, and that risks an imbalance where the analyst is going to be much more provocative, much more spur of the moment, off the cuff kinds of things. And I don't know that there's any. It's not like you can remind them, hey, this is a public medium, be professional. I think it's a challenging thing because it is a much more informal, real-time, and often disposable medium. It's not like I put a tweet out there, and unlike the New York Times, it has a daily, section of corrections. I put a tweet out there, and of the 30,000 I've done, I've probably deleted 4.
Right, you can always delete a tweet. I think one thing people, especially novices with social media, if there are any out there left, maybe people who are just being born, but the difference between a direct tweet and a regular tweet. Sometimes what you want to tweet in private goes out to the entire follower base. So you just want to be careful with what you do there, but that's easily corrected. Again, you can always delete it and assume that not that many people have seen it. The other thing is just in terms of what you're asking for. I think the same rules apply on a briefing. You can't necessarily ask for feedback depending on which firm you're briefing. Some firms are very stringent upon what feedback they provide when you're doing a briefing. The same thing with Twitter or other social media when you're interacting with an analyst. What's proper to ask for and what's not proper. You're not going to ask them for a quote via Twitter unless it's a direct message to arrange something. So I think those sort of things you have to keep in mind.
Okay, so I think we're coming up for the end of our 45 minutes together. There's one last question from Larry. Interested to hear the panel's perspective on how they see analyst firms balancing analyst social media activities with core research, which is typically governed by a specific research process. So social media happens outside of the parameters of the specific research process. How are people dealing with that?
Well, I think you see some analysts who are successful with blogging, other analysts who have started a blog and maybe have had one or two entries and then it sort of trails off, and that may be a function of their workload, or it may be a function of their interest or their engagement, or maybe they didn't get the feedback that they wanted. So I think everything is on an individual case. I think the smart analyst firm will leverage social media, and this is pretty much how we kick the conversation off with Jonathan's remarks. The smart analyst firm will leverage social media to drive interest, to drive views on the published research. Of course, if you're tweeting a link to content that's behind a paywall, it may not be effective, but those of us who are in the profession should usually be able to get access to that.
I'd say, back to our earlier discussion about metrics, look at analyst metrics. Most of them, almost all of them, are not compensated for Facebook posts or tweets or even necessarily how many people read their research notes. So, the firm-wide embrace of social media is very inconsistent, and it's, therefore, very much on an analyst by analyst basis. Do they view this as good for their standing and impact in the community? Does it give them better insights? Those kinds of things. But it's very much on an analyst by analyst basis and situation by situation basis. We've seen analysts who were active in one place and moved somewhere else where perhaps the activity was frowned upon, or their priorities changed. So it's a very dynamic thing. I think the analyst firms have grossly underutilized social media at a broad level because I go back, as I said, I started at Gartner in 1987. And back then, our guidance when talking to the media was be careful about giving away things for which clients are paying $15,000. I've always taken the attitude that if I could give away in a single quote in a journalist article what the client was paying $15,000 for, either I'm damn good or we're overpriced. But I think a lot of that attitude still exists, and therefore they're balancing the how do I want to influence the broader market versus how do I want to be perceived by my paying clients. I think it's a silly perspective, though.
Stephen, would you like to have the final word?
Yeah, I think Jonathan and Michael stole my thunder on that last point, but it's and it was a good question raised by Larry. I think it's grossly social media is grossly underused in the analyst landscape, and it should be in broader use. I know for a fact that I follow a lot of analyst blogs. And really, try to study what the analyst is saying on a regular basis. It's much more than that market research report, which is still very important. But reading their blogs, reading their comments on a regular basis, whether they're attending a trade show, whether they're commenting about a significant trend in the market, it's pretty important. So.
Thank you so much. Well, look, I'm going to draw the call to an end now. Just as a reminder, if people want to be kept in touch, let me just go back to that bit.ly address up at the top of the slide. If people want to make sure they're finding out about webinars that we're having, go to that LinkedIn address, find Analyst Relations Forum group in LinkedIn. We're going to put this recording onto YouTube and put a link to that in the group as well. So feel free to share that. And of course, if you've got suggestions for topics you'd like us to pick up in the Analyst Solutions Forum webinars, let us know. I think in the next quarter we're going to be focusing a lot on sales enablement and looking to see what organizations are doing to get more leverage out of the relationships that AR teams are building with the sales force and with lead development, lead generation and business development more broadly. I just want to finish off by thanking our speakers very much for their time. Jonathan, Mike, Steve, it's been fantastic to have you on the call. We really appreciate your time, and we hope to have you back on other calls in the future. So thank you very much. Take care.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks. Look forward to it.
Thanks.
All righty.